It's very funny. I don't know if it's funny or not, but one of the questions yesterday was a question about sources. And in the last time I taught this class, in the notes I have here, the question appeared in the exact same moment in the course, in the previous course. So I would say that if you want to understand what I'm drawing from in giving these lectures, I would say, as far as classical sources, it's the Republic of Plato, the Laws of Plato, the Gorgias would be three classical sources. Also, the Politics of Aristotle, the City of God of Augustine, and then I would say also, first part of the second part of the Summa, questions 90 to 108, and then questions about virtue and vice that are throughout the Summa and the corpus of the works of Aquinas. Then, in my own, if I were to say my own reading that had the biggest impact on me outside of those things, one would be Thucydides, especially the parts of the Peloponnesian War where he describes the political makeup of Athens during the war. Also, the parts of Thucydides where he describes the revolutions that take place during the Peloponnesian War. Then, I read several works by Robert Nisbet in the late 1990s, early 2000s. The Twilight of Authority was one of them, as well as Alistair McIntyre's Three Rival Versions of Moral Inquiry. And those books were both Three Rival Versions and Robert Nisbet, Twilight of Authority. They're both books where there's an overlap in both of those books between sociology and political philosophy. And then, thanks to Dwight Duncan, in 2002, 2003, I read this book, Cardinal Kroll and the Cultural Revolution, which is that book has one piece of evidence one thing that's very helpful about that book is that the author had access to the archives of Cardinal Kroll, like all the archives of Cardinal Kroll. And that's while Cardinal Kroll was still alive. And we're not going to see, so he got access to the archives. After this book came out, the archives were immediately closed, because the normal thing in history is that archives remain closed for 60 to 70 years after a person dies. And I think once this book came out, it was kind of clear why that should be the case. Because, a lot of primary evidence, it can say things about the character of the person, or the character of people involved. But it's a valuable book because he does quote primary evidence that no one will see probably for another 30 years.
Who was Cardinal Kroll?
Cardinal Kroll was the Cardinal Archbishop of Philadelphia. And first, the joke about the competition. What's first place?
Oh yes, this is W.C. Fields. First place is A Night in Philadelphia. Second place is A Week in Philadelphia. Third place is A Month in
Philadelphia. So Cardinal Kroll, and the reason also his life and work is so interesting is that he served on the committee for dealing with Hollywood as a bishop. He served on the committee for dealing with life issues, so Planned Parenthood and abortion, contraception and abortion, and also universities, so Catholic University of America. So he was involved from the 60s to the 90s, he was part of all these major debates about the culture and education that took place. There's also there's also evidence in Cardinal Kroll about Martin Mullen. Martin Mullen was a representative from a district in Philadelphia, from wherever Blessed Sacrament Parish was. And Martin Mullen did it. He was a heroic figure, a heroic politician, both for fighting for life and for, against contraception, pro-family, pro-life. And he's one of the few that realized now I'll tell you something in 2015, I was in Rome with Cardinal Stafford. We had lunch together. And after lunch, Cardinal Stafford asked me, what are some of the books? He kind of asked me this kind of a question that we've been discussing, like, what are some of the books that have the biggest effect on you in your life? And what do you think are the most insightful? And so I told him, I said, well, actually, one of them I think was Cardinal Kroll. And then Stafford said, well, I knew Cardinal Kroll. What's the point of it? What do you think is the biggest argument of the book? Right? Is the next question. I said, well, obviously I just said what I just said to you, but then I said on top of that, I think in all these areas, the cardinal was being undermined by his staff. The people on his staff were working with the enemies at the Rockefeller Foundation, various Jewish groups, various radical groups. And Cardinal Kroll never figured out that his staff was working against the policies he was trying to implement. That's something that Martin Mullen, I think, discovered and tried to communicate to Cardinal Kroll. And then Stafford said to me, whoever wrote that book is absolutely right. He said, he would say, I would say that was how I was. For like the first half of my career as a bishop. And then I realized when I was in Denver what was going on. So I shut down the seminary and restarted it. I basically fired. Over time, you can't just fire people, but I just basically got rid of everybody and restarted the whole operation. No, that was Chaput. Yeah. So anyway, so I would say that book, we haven't gotten yet to what I'm going to tell you a bit that's in that book as far as the course goes. But then that book, then I read Slaughter of Cities. I read Libido Dominandi. By the way, Libido Dominandi is becoming a more popular book right now than it was 20 years ago. The whole Groyper movement. But what's interesting is it's leading to many conversions. And it's also a book that there's a certain kind of person that reads that book, and just reading that book, he gives up his bad habits. Libido Dominandi. Libido Dominandi.
What's it about?
It's about the sexual revolution from the Marquis de Sade to the 1990s. The history of sexual revolution from the Marquis de Sade, French Revolution. So I guess I have given you parts of that book already in this class, up until the 1990s. And then the Jewish Revolutionary Spirit, Barren Metal, and then I'm reading right now Logos Rising.
What is that?
Logos Rising. It's a history of Logos. The history of Logos and the Logos of history. The first half of the book is the history of Logos. The second half of the book is the Logos of history. The first 3 or 4 chapters, he deals with the arguments of the new atheists. He deconstructs them. And then after he deconstructs the arguments of the new atheists, like on evolution, the existence of God, honing in on these big questions. After he critiques the arguments of the new atheists. And actually, one of the things he points out when he deals with the arguments of the new atheists is that they actually don't have, many of them don't even have arguments. They just make assertions when it comes to God. They just make these kind of bald assertions. And if you go to their books and you kind of piece out their arguments, you start to see this. So then he gives a kind of, after those 3-4 chapters, then he gives a history of Logos from ancient Persia up until the time up until William of Ockham. And then in the second half of the book, the second half of the book is the Logos of history, because it's after the Reformation that you start to get people like Giambattista Vico and then Hegel that they pick up what Augustine started in the 3rd and 4th century. This effort of saying, can we look into history? Can we look into history and politics, and can we find in there the workings of logos, right? The workings of the second person of the Trinity. So that's the second half of that book. Question?
Can you explain why you didn't mention Thomas More's Utopia in your list?
Well, so I used to teach Thomas More's Utopia, and I would say that so Thomas More's Utopia is a book that really helps you to think about things. It's hard to give. It's hard to give in the way I'm presenting this material. So I'm the list I'm giving is what material have I read that's in this material. But I would say that my own personal experience with Thomas More's Utopia is that I never actually had it in a class. It's one of those books I had to teach myself, and I think it's good that I never had actually. And I'll tell you the story, so I'll tell you why it's good. I probably never had a professor teach me that book. So the first time I read it, I get to the end, and the whole time I'm reading the book, I'm asking myself, "There's something wrong here. There's something not right." This guy Raphael, like he's got the name Raphael. Thomas More makes him look like Socrates, but he's not Socrates. He's not a Socratic figure at all. I mean, he's not as virtuous as Socrates. Raphael is the main guy in Thomas More's Utopia. And then I'm reading his description of utopia, and I'm saying to myself, this is not a utopia. This is awful, right? But I know just from talking with people over the years, people say about, oh, utopia, wouldn't it be great to live in utopia? So I think about it some more. And especially once I get to the end, when they basically start to, say things like, well, Raphael, he clearly was not. This is not an exact quote, but they were essentially saying Raphael is clearly not having a good day, and there were many strange and weird things that he was saying that I would wish rather than hope would come to pass. And if you know Latin, you know that he's using the wish there as an optative, which means I would wish in the sense of like it's just a dream. It's not connected to reality. It would just be some sort of future thing that could never actually happen. So then I said, man, I got to reread the Utopia now, because this is a critique of utopia. This is not praising utopia. This is basically an example of the rise of a totalitarian society. In other words, you use in the first book, there's this kind of critique of how politics works, the dirty aspects of politics. Right, there's a critique of, well, what it would be like, Raphael, I would never go into a court, because in a court, you'd have to give advice about domestic politics. And what is domestic politics but stealing land from poor people, right? And if I had to go into the court to advise the king, I'd have to give advice about foreign politics. And what is foreign politics but tricking yourself into think that you can use just war theory to actually aggressively take over other nations, I could never be involved in politics. So in other words, but then after this critique of politics, of the dirtiness of politics, he then proposes this totalitarian society, which is really much worse than any of the possible solutions of getting involved in dirty politics to actually carry it out. So it's meant to be a critique of utopic solutions to real world problems. So I would say that once I read that, then I would teach the Utopia, and I taught it this way, in a couple courses, and my students would take what I was saying to other courses where they were reading the Utopia, and they would get silenced, by the professors. They were like, "No, and actually there was this one naive freshman girl. She said, she came back to class one day. She said, Professor Langen, we just read the Utopia in this class, and then I went to this other class. And I was just telling the professor, just look at the text. Would you want to work in a ditch with an animal skin on your back for the rest of your life? Do you think that's like one of the things that the great workers of the Utopia do, right? They work in a ditch with an animal skin on their back for the rest of their lives. And the guy was like, the guy had never thought through the image, right, before. He was like, well, of course I would, you know? And she's like, are you sure? Could we take a poll? She actually said this. I mean, she was kind of a funny girl. She said, could we take a poll of the class? I mean, who here would like to work in a ditch with an animal skin on their back for the rest of their lives? And like, everyone was like, absolutely not. And then finally, the teacher said, I silence you. We have to go. We're going to have to continue reading this book as if this scene were a good scene. And then I said to her, I said, well, let me guess. Is your professor Professor so-and-so? Like he was the Marxist.
Yeah.
He was the Marxist in the Kellogg school at the time, like the Catholic Marxist, right? So then I was feeling a little bit like, oh, maybe am I going too far here?
No.
And I saw Jerry Wegemer.
That's just good.
And so Jerry,
Life is like a story. Bro.
Jerry and I started, Jerry, like so this was like in the back of my mind, right? So Jerry said to me, so what are you doing? I said, well, I'm teaching Intro to Political Philosophy, da, 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 da. He said, well, what books do you have in your course? I said, well, I got these books, this book, and I teach Thomas More's Utopia. He says, oh, what do you think about Thomas More's Utopia? And this was like, at this moment, my own psychology at this moment, I was super nervous because I was thinking, oh my gosh, this is one of those moments where like I might disagree with someone I respect because I had never really read anything. At that point, I had not read anything that Jerry had written about the Utopia or anything like that. So I'm like, well, if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. I'll defer to the master. So I basically told him a version of what I just told you. And he's like, that's exactly what I think about it. So many people don't know how to read the Utopia. So many people don't know how to read anymore. But then I went and read what Jerry had to write about the Utopia so that I at least have some backup if they ever tried to pound on me again, my colleagues.
New translation's coming out.
His translation?
Not his translation, but they're working on a new translation.
Mm.
So he's collaborating.
Okay, good. Yes.
Don't you see that though? There are large parts of the Republic where the ideal state, actually, if you read closely, right? Wow, this sounds terrible. Just like what?
Yeah.
Anyway, so and that's it. It does seem, in some ways, it seems similar to the Republic in that way. Even though Raphael Hythloday is not exactly Socrates. Socrates seems to be purposely using this as didactic tool, which Raphael actually believes.
Right. Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
That's how I would teach the Republic and the Utopia next to each other.
Okay.
That and precisely I would, at least when I taught the Republic, I would really emphasize that you got to understand at the beginning of book 2, Socrates says, we're now going to create a city which is a macro version of the soul, right? Because we're trying to understand the soul, but the soul is really tiny and you can't really see it. So if you want to understand the soul, you got to blow it up. Well, how can we blow it up? Let's make a city that's an image of the soul. And so at least when I read the Republic, I extend that image all the way through to help us understand some of these crazy scenes that Socrates himself knows that he's giving us a crazy city. Well, he's not because he's telling us this city should ever come into effect, but he just wants to help us start to distinguish between the parts of the soul and how the different parts of the soul might relate to each other. So I would say that it's actually reading the Utopia that kind of helped me develop a little bit more of a conspiratorial bent, but in this sense, right? In the sense of, politics is dirty. Politics is a game of mirrors. You got to be willing to enter into that game of mirrors and try to understand what's the truth of the matter, so that you can try to understand how to reform things in a genuine spirit of reform.
And that doesn't mean you have to enter into evil, which is the
Right.
way Machiavelli would go
Right.
all the way that way.
Exactly.
And Moore is trying not to do
Exactly. I would teach I would teach Moore next to Machiavelli. I would go The Little Prince, Machiavelli, Moore as three little books to consider next to each other that are all kind of honing in on this theme. And I would also say this aspect is very important. It's very important also for especially when you have to help anybody. Maybe this is more for priests, but it can also happen to us, right? Anytime you have to help somebody who's in a dirty profession, or a profession where there's a lot of corruption, or a profession that, let's say, used to be Christian, but now there's a lot of pagan ideals which have reasserted themselves, right? The temptation always is just to get out. Or the other temptation is to do the evil that the other people are doing and not ask any questions. So then the big question is, well, how do you stay in and reform over time? Right? Obviously, there's some things you can't do, right? So how do you stay in and reform over time? I think a lot of good supernumeraries, I think that disposition will be the disposition of a lot of good supernumeraries, right? And so we have to help them. This is where being aware of the complication of life can help us to help them.
That's what our father said. He thought that Moore had lived today, he would have been a great superhero.
Yeah.
And I always think of in the Utopia that the key part for me was where Raphael comes to the end of some long thing, and then basically Thomas kind of comes in, he reappears as sort of the host of the whole thing.
Yeah.
He doesn't say anything, just kind of shrugs his shoulders and says,
Yeah.
Because he's the statesman. He's
Right.
like, yeah, that sort of makes sense, but something's not quite right.
And he
Let's
can't,
move on.
right. And he
I
can't,
can't really say anything in response.
Right.
His prudence is so much involved.
Right.
It's hard to put words.
right. He feeds him lunch.
Yeah, right.
Basically,
Yeah.
he gives him lunch but also because he reads the situation, I think, and he knows that this is not the kind of guy you can contradict, very easily. So you can't challenge him very easily. So you got to kind of give him a good meal and then maybe talk about it later.
Dialogue of comfort against tribulation.
Yeah. So and part of being a statesman is knowing how to read the circumstances and how to act and what to say in those circumstances. I would say then another influence, at least for this class, are the lectures of John Rao, R-A-O. And he has a series, I met John in Estonia. It's funny, we lived within within 2 miles of each other in Manhattan in 2016. But I met him in Estonia in 2008. That's where we became friends. And so John is a historian. He's been a historian his whole life. He was trained in Cambridge, and he's been a professor at St. John's University. For the last 30 some years, he's given lectures on the history of the church. And he gives about 20 lectures a year in basically a seminar room for whoever wants to come every other Sunday. And he started in 30 AD. And he basically said, I'm going to go at the pace that I think is sufficient to give the lectures. And he's recorded them all. And beginning, I think 3 years ago, he began recording them and immediately putting them on SoundCloud. So now on SoundCloud, we have from basically 1750 to I forget if this year's lectures end. I forget if they end with the beginning, because I haven't finished them yet. But I forget if they end with the beginning of the First World War or the end of the First World War. So basically, I've listened to, in the last 4 or 5 years, 1750 to, let's say, 1915. They're really, for me, I really like them because they're not just general sweeps, which you can get like reading any book. And they're not excessively detailed, but they're sufficiently detailed. And then, of course, he gives all of his sources if you want to go further into anything. But John has a mind. His mind is very much like the mind of Christopher Dawson, in that he also has a great facility for putting together philosophical ideas with the movements of history. So his lectures are very helpful. They're very insightful. I think they're very helpful. Sometimes I think that I like them because I already have kind of an introduction to a lot of the general ideas and the general movements of the time from 1750 to 1915. And for me, his lectures just give a lot of details to fill in the blanks, as do the works of Dr. Jones that I've already mentioned. And then one book that I found helpful for this class also is Fire in the Minds of Men by Frank Bowman. And then there's a book that I'm looking forward to reading. So I on top of all this, of course, the manuals that I've given you, especially the ones I've read and thought more about are Christian State and Grenier, because the integralism one just came out. So I just haven't had time to kind of chew on it yet. But, and then I've had conversations with Russell Hittinger about a book that's supposed to come out 3 years ago, but it still hasn't come out with University of Yale Press. And that book, what Hittinger set out to do in the late 90s is he began reading the development of Catholic social teaching from the French Revolution to the present. And his goal was to read everything that he could, everything that potentially had an influence on the Pope, from the French Revolution to the present on Catholic social teaching. So I've had conversations with him about this book, but I don't think the book has yet come out. Yes.
Where do you see yourself fitting into this picture and kind of contributing to it?
I can't. I don't have time.
No, but I mean, just in terms of your career.
I would say what I'm trying to do is put together everything I just listed to you. I'm trying to put all of those, I'm trying to put together, on the one hand, the manual tradition with an understanding of the last 250 years of political history, combined with what are the sound ideas of political philosophy that we get from the tradition. So I think you could say I'm trying to put those three things together into a whole. One of my friends that I was with in Rome, he's not a priest of the work, but he's a priest now in an order. He said that he thinks what's needed is some sort of a mixture, almost like, they have medical ethics textbooks. It would be great to have a political ethics textbook. And that you would have to fuse these three things together, I think, to have a political ethics textbook. Something that would give you the principles, would give you a sense of where we stand in history, and then would also give you a sense of some cases, so as to be able to start to work through how you apply principles to cases. I want to say a few things about the I want to start now, like the 1820s to 1850. And let's start with Latin America. Okay. From England, from France in the French Revolution, and then from Spain, many Red Lodges went to Latin America. And with those Red Lodges also went many of the ideals of the French Revolution. And we're doing kind of a broad sweep here. But so Gregory the 16th, let's say, is the Pope in the 1820s and 30s. Gregory the 16th sends two ambassadors to do a tour of Latin America in the 1820s and 30s. One of those ambassadors is the future Blessed Pius IX. And those two ambassadors, after I think they're like on a 9-year tour of Latin America, from Mexico all the way down to Argentina and Chile, and then back up to Mexico again. They do kind of a loop. And so after this 9-year loop of studying the influence of the French Revolution, at that point, the ideas came mostly just to the elites, not to the peasants, the rebel. So the report of these two ambassadors to Gregory the 16th was, their sense was that the great weight of the people in Latin America was essentially Catholic. That if you had authentic democracy in Latin America, you would essentially have Catholic nations because the people were Catholic. So their recommendation to Gregory the 16th, as far as like shaping Latin America over the next, generation or so, was to basically keep steering the people to be Catholic and to actually be pro-democracy in Latin America. And that eventually, their hope was that, the thought was that eventually these Masonic clubs, right, the right, the left, the elitists, whoever they are, eventually, if we keep pressing for democracy, those clubs will filter away, and genuine moral, Catholic morals will be upheld in these societies. So I just say that, I think it's worth saying that, is that because when you start to speak about the problems in Europe in the 19th century, right, and also oftentimes the way the problems in Europe get articulated, you don't often see the maybe the pragmatism of the church or the awareness even of people like it's interesting, right? Because Blessed Pius IX, he's known as this authoritarian. He has a bad reputation in some circles. No one would ever think that Blessed Pius IX, as an ambassador, would have recommended, let's promote democracy in Latin America, right? No one would ever say such a thing. Or few people, I think, I think people would be surprised to hear that. If we turn to Europe, and I think France, we've most studied France up to this point, for better or for worse. We see this dynamic still work, especially in the 1820s and 30s. We see this dynamic still working itself out in France. There are clearly factions among the elites of French society. There are both moderate and radical royalists. There are some moderate royalists. They want to have they're fine with a constitutional monarchy. There's also radical royalists who say we should just go back to the ancient regime. You still have Jansenists hanging around. The Jansenists in France tend to be lawyers. You also have Huguenots hanging around. They tend to be lawyers. They also tend to be liberal. There are still Gallicans. They want to de-emphasize the papal authority so that the church and the state in France can kind of deal with each other. Already in the 1820s, you have Bonapartists that think that some successor of some child or grandchild or nephew of Napoleon should be the real ruler in France. There's still these factions that come out of the French Revolution present. The Girondins, who are they're now more moderate, arguing that France should still have some sort of decentralized system. You have the more radical Jacobins that eventually develop into what we would call socialism. And then you also have Catholic reformers, right? Catholics who reassert themselves into the upper echelons of French life. Now, a dynamic starts in the 1920s and 30s, and this dynamic is whenever you expand the franchise, the royalist parties tend to win. Whenever you reduce the franchise, the liberal parties tend to win. So it's actually the opposite of what you would think. At least me hanging around universities my whole life. I think if I were to ask my political science colleagues in 1820 in 1830 in France, if there was a popular election, who would win most of the vote? They would probably say, oh, of course, the socialists. But in reality, the Marxists have done all this. They've counted all the votes for us. That's one of the great things Marxists do, is they do all this really meticulous look into the information that's available. In reality, whenever they expanded the franchise, if they expanded the franchise, now here in the 1820s and 30s, we're talking about going from 1% of the population to 10% of the population. Right? So the expansion of the franchise is not everybody voting. But the liberals if they narrowed the franchise to 1 or 2% of the vote, the liberals tended to win. If they expanded it beyond 2% of the vote, the royalists tended to win. I mentioned in the last class the emergence in Catholic circles, especially these study circles. Also, just as something that we don't realize about 19th century France, 19th century Europe, something that was huge in the 19th century France were singing clubs. They would go to these clubs. There were over 3,000 in France. And again, it's funny that it was very controlled who could write the lyrics for these singing clubs. And ironically, the liberal factions got control of the lyric writing for the singing clubs. Just as in the 1930s, let's say, when Roosevelt doled out the influence over culture, he put the communists into most of the cultural positions, writing songs, making music, stuff like that. And also, in 1824, Charles X, they have a wider election. So Charles X, who is an ultra monarchist, he comes to power. He gets the majority of votes, so he can come to power. The liberals are so upset that we start to see in 1824, 1830, some of the first developments of what later on becomes public relations, for lack of a better word. And there's a concerted effort from 1824 until 1830 or so to try to create an environment that's so hostile for Charles X that essentially he has to go away. And who leads this effort? The Jacobins lead this effort. The Girondins go along with it. The Bonapartists go. And basically, everybody piles on Charles X because they essentially see, if we can get rid of Charles X, obviously we can have a new force, a new process, and we have a better chance of forming the government.
So those who vote for Charles X are royalists?
Pardon?
Those who vote or put Charles X.
They were royalists, yeah. So in other words, in 1824, they had an election for what the government should be like. The liberals wanted 1 or 2% to vote. They weren't able to win, so there was 10% of the population voted. And in that 10% that voted, the majority chose Charles X to be the king. So what do? They essentially renew the public relations effort that the Jesuits are plotting to take over France and the world. The Black Conspiracy. This actual conspiracy is, I think it's interesting just to lay out once what it's like. This conspiracy was made through the literary circles in France. It was promoted by the Jacobins, who were becoming the new. They were soon going to become the new socialists. Many other groups went along with it. Many in the literary circles went along with it, from Victor Hugo to Nerval to others. All the professoriate went along with it. The basic content of this conspiracy theory was that there were 50,000 Jesuits at the main Jesuit seminary in France. 50,000 Jesuits.
That's accurate.
Well, hang on. This is the conspiracy theory, right? There were 50,000 Jesuits in the main seminary in France, Montrouge, right? They were working through the congregation, spreading their books throughout France and throughout Europe. The Jesuits were going to use Charles X in order to abuse everybody else. They were essentially a secret society, and that Charles was part of it.
I wish that was the case, actually.
Yeah. So, and the idea behind this conspiracy was, again, to recreate the Black Legend, right? To make it appear that the Jesuits and the monarch were conspiring together, so that all of the elites would turn on the king. And the idea was, if all the elites turn on the king, well, then the rabble will also turn on the king. The conspiracy also claimed that Muslims and the Templar Knights and that even Freemasons were conspiring with the Jesuits against the French nation. That if you look in the past, you can see that the Voltaire was a Jesuit. All Freemasons were Jesuits. The Jacobins were Jesuits. Again, and the idea is to create an environment, and the environment happened. So that in 1828 to 1830, they forced elections, and in these elections, the radical Jacobins won. After the Jacobins won, the Jesuits were put on trial. And during the trial, of course, it came out. There were not 50,000 Jesuits in the seminary there who were conspiring. There were probably only 1,000 Jesuits in the world at that point. And after this was shown that there were only 1,000 Jesuits at that point, the conspirator said that proves the conspiracy. Right? The Jesuits are so good. They're able to hide the existence of 49,000 members. Right? So the fruit of this trial is that the new radical Jacobins that came to power, they were able to declare Jesuit high schools illegal. They were able to close down all of the Jesuit seminaries in France. After this happens, the bishops of France and the Jesuits, they send a note to the Pope asking him what they should do. And Leo XII responds, maybe Leo XI, I think. He responds and he says, don't do anything. Just quietly obey. There's nothing really you can do at this point. So we'll stop there. So that's just a little... So we go into that one example to say that a lot of the politics in France, especially in these next 70, 80 years, it's going to be these various groups that mature in various ways. And these groups that mature in various ways, they have an influence both back in Spain, in Italy, in Germany, and also in Latin America. Because there are connections between these groups into all of those other areas. And also there will be spillover into these other nations because of what's going on in France.